Hey guys, I never thought I'd be sharing something like this here. Honestly, I've always been someone who lived a pretty quiet life. For those who don't know me, I spent most of my adult years as a nun. Yeah, really. My life was simple. Prayers, community work, helping the needy. Nothing dramatic or exciting. But then, everything changed one morning, about 3 months ago. It started like any other day. I woke up early, around 4 a.m., in my little room. The weather was cold and rainy, and I remember feeling unusually tired. My body just didn't feel right, kind of heavy and drained. I figured it was exhaustion from all the fasting and late-night prayers, so I ignored it. But as I reached over to grab a glass of water next to my bed, my hand felt strangely numb. I shook it off, thinking it was nothing. But within seconds my vision blurred. The room seemed to spin around me, and suddenly, breathing felt almost impossible, as if a huge weight was pressing on my chest. Before I knew it, the glass slipped through my fingers, shattered, and I collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The next moments are hard to describe because I've honestly never experienced anything even remotely like this before. At first, everything just went dark. I'm talking complete, absolute darkness. Not like turning off the lights, more like being sucked into a place with nothing, not even a sense of space. It felt as if I was floating, but I didn't really have a body. Strangely, I could still sense my surroundings without seeing anything at all. Then suddenly, I realized I was actually looking down at myself, lying lifeless on the floor. It was surreal. Almost as if I was watching a scene from a movie. I saw Elena, one of the sisters from the convent, rush into my room, panic written all over her face. She was shouting, desperately calling for help, fumbling with her phone as she tried to dial an ambulance. I felt no pain, no panic, just this weird detachment, like I was observing something that didn't truly involve me. And right when I started wondering if I was actually dead, something invisible started pulling me upward, gently at first, then stronger, as if a current was lifting me higher and higher away from my body and the life I'd known. As I continued rising, it felt like reality itself had slipped away. Soon the room, Elena's cries, even my own body vanished beneath me, and I was completely surrounded by this immense, deep blackness. It wasn't scary at first, just empty. But then, something shifted. The silence that had been almost peaceful turned into a strange, unsettling whispering. At first, the whispers were faint, like distant echoes, hard to make out clearly. But quickly, they grew louder, overlapping and becoming frantic. The voices felt tormented, pleading, filled with sadness and despair. I couldn't see anyone, but it felt like countless souls were trapped around me, each voice desperate to be heard, each one filled with regret. The darkness itself seemed heavy, suffocating, almost alive. Panic slowly crept in. I tried to scream, but I had no mouth. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go, and I had no legs to carry me. A terrifying thought hit me. Was this hell? Had I been wrong all my life, despite dedicating myself to God? A deep sense of dread filled me. The kind you feel when you're trapped in a nightmare but can't wake up. The whispers intensified, surrounding me completely, as if they were trying to pull me deeper into the darkness. At that point, something even worse happened. Out of that endless darkness, I felt a presence emerge. Not something I could see or touch, but I knew instantly it was there. Huge, powerful, and oppressive. I felt it watching me, studying me. The whispers changed into screams and wails, becoming unbearable. Whatever this presence was, it radiated pure hopelessness, anger, and a kind of misery that I didn't think was even possible. I felt myself shrinking, like a tiny speck about to be crushed under the weight of this terrifying force. I remember begging inwardly, screaming in my mind for help. I called out desperately to God, to anyone, just to save me from whatever this thing was. And that's when, just as I felt completely overwhelmed and on the brink of despair, A small, bright pinpoint of light appeared in the distance. It was tiny at first, barely noticeable, but immediately I felt something shift. The presence recoiled slightly, hesitating. The screams quieted just a bit. That small glimmer of light started growing, brighter and warmer, cutting through the darkness with a force that made the oppressive presence pull back even more. Hope surged through me, even though I had no idea what was coming next. As I kept observing, I noticed something unusual about these people. On their foreheads or right hands, everyone had a small mark, something subtle, almost hidden, like a tiny tattoo or emblem. At first glance, you wouldn't even notice it, but once you saw it, you realized it was everywhere, on screens, billboards, and even on digital scanners at stores and offices. People used these marks like IDs, scanning them to enter buildings, buy food, or get onto buses. It seemed practical and efficient, but something felt deeply unsettling. Then I realized the problem. Everyone was identical, not physically, but emotionally. There was no joy, no sadness, no love, just empty eyes and expressionless faces. I had the overwhelming feeling that these people had willingly given up something incredibly precious, something human, just to live comfortably and securely. They didn't resist or question anything. They'd chosen convenience and security over their own humanity, and it left me chilled to my core. It was clear this mark wasn't just a simple convenience, it was symbolic of something deeper and much darker, a surrender of the very thing that makes us alive. Then Jesus' voice came back into my mind, calm yet filled with sorrow. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. Before I could process what he meant, the scene shifted again. Now I saw people who had refused the mark, ordinary men, women, even families. They looked exhausted, thin, and anxious, living in makeshift camps and abandoned buildings, hiding in forests or remote places. Their lives were incredibly hard. No stores would sell them food. No hospitals would treat them. Society had turned its back on them entirely, labeling them dangerous outsiders, extremists who disrupted order. Despite this, I noticed something astonishing in their eyes, a spark, a kind of life and resolve that was totally absent from the others. They hadn't surrendered. One image in particular stays with me. A mother in a marketplace holding money, begging to buy bread for her kids, and being refused because she lacked the mark. Her desperation hit me deep, yet even in her tears, she stood firm. It was heartbreaking, but also inspiring, seeing people choose suffering over spiritual compromise. It struck me hard. These people weren't just making a stand. They were choosing to remain fully alive, even if it cost them everything. As I watched these people who had refused the mark, I felt something stir deep inside me. Their faith, their strength in the face of unimaginable hardship was beyond inspiring. It was awe-inspiring. I saw them praying together, their voices soft but united, calling out for help, for strength, for a miracle. And, unbelievably, miracles started to happen. One night, I watched as a man knelt on the dry ground in a desolate place, his hands raised up in desperate prayer. His family stood behind him, emaciated, their faces gaunt from hunger. But as he prayed, something incredible occurred. The earth beneath him started to tremble slightly. Then a shoot of green pushed up from the cracked soil. Slowly, more plants sprouted, vines heavy with fruit, roots twisting deep into the ground. It was like a sudden gift from God, food where there had been none, and it didn't stop there. Another time, I saw a woman, shaking and terrified, holding her feverish child. She placed her hand on the child's forehead and cried out, "Jesus, you healed the sick. You made the blind see. We have nothing left, but we turn to you." In that instant, the child gasped, and the fever disappeared. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing, but I knew. Deep down, I knew. These people weren't alone. God was with them. He had not abandoned them. and He was providing in ways I could never have imagined. But the struggle wasn't easy, and it wasn't the same for everyone. As I watched more, I saw something equally heartbreaking. Some people, desperate and fearful, started to question their choices. A man, once strong in his faith, held his starving daughter in his arms. His eyes were filled with pain, and he whispered, "How can I let her suffer like this? Surely God will understand if I take the mark just to feed her, just to save her." His hands shook as he looked at his wife, hoping she'd agree, but she only shook her head, tears running down her face. "If we lose everything, but keep our souls, we have lost nothing," she said. "But if we gain the world and lose our souls, we have lost everything." The man turned away, clearly torn between his love for his family and his faith. I felt the weight of that moment in my chest. How many of us would face that same decision? And yet, despite the suffering, many stood firm. They understood what was at stake, what they were choosing. Some would hold on, others would give in. But in that moment, I saw the truth. The decision was not just about survival. It was about something eternal, something far bigger than this life. Then Jesus spoke again, and this time His voice was stronger, filled with a sense of urgency that I couldn't ignore. "Tell them," He said, His voice resonating deep within me. "The time is short." The moment He spoke those words, I felt the weight of them like a hammer striking my chest. The light around Him grew even brighter, and the scene began to shift once more. I found myself standing in the middle of a vast city, but this time it was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was clean, orderly, and seemingly perfect. Everyone moved with precision, their faces emotionless, as if they were simply going through the motions of life without truly living. The streets were bustling, but no one spoke to each other. No one smiled. Digital screens flashed messages of unity, peace, and progress, but everything felt empty. It was as if the world had become a massive machine, running without any human connection. I looked around, and my heart sank as I realized what had happened. These people had all taken the mark. They had surrendered their humanity for a life of comfort and stability. But in doing so, they had lost everything that made them human. Their souls were gone. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't just a political system or a technological advancement. This was a spiritual decision, a choice that stripped them of their freedom, their love, and their essence. I wanted to scream, to warn them, but I couldn't. I could only watch, helpless. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A child, no older than 5, was walking alone through the streets, calling out for his mother. His voice cracked with desperation as he reached out to passers-by, but none of them even noticed him. They didn't even look down at him. He was invisible to them, and that's when I understood. The mark had erased their ability to feel, to care, to love. They were walking shells, trapped in a society that demanded total conformity. It was as if the very essence of what it meant to be human had been erased. And for a brief moment, I felt something deep inside me, a terrifying thought. What if I was seeing a future where this was all inevitable, where we were all forced to choose between our faith and our survival, and most chose to surrender? The feeling was suffocating. I wanted to turn away, but the scene kept unfolding before my eyes, relentless and painful, as if the truth was something I had no choice but to see. Then, as if everything had been leading up to this moment, the scene shifted once more, and I found myself in a completely different place, far from the city, deep into what seemed like the wilderness. The air was cold, the sky dark, and the land was barren, covered with rocks and dried-up earth. I saw people scattered in the distance, walking aimlessly, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They were the unmarked, those who had refused to take the mark. They had been cast out, rejected by society, left to survive in isolation. I saw a man kneeling in the dirt, trying to dig for food, his hands raw and bleeding. He was once a respected doctor, now nothing more than a shadow of his former self. His name had been erased, his records wiped out. He was a nobody in a world that no longer had room for people like him. Nearby, I saw a young woman sitting by an old church, clutching a tattered Bible, her hands trembling as she read by the dim light of a single candle. She hadn't given up. She still held on to her faith, despite everything. I saw families scattered, alone, rejected by the very people they once loved. It was painful to witness, yet there was something incredibly powerful about it. They were alive in a way that the marked had lost. They had suffered, yes, but they hadn't given in. And somehow, in their pain, they still had hope. The contrast between them and the marked was too stark to ignore. These people were real, flesh and blood, broken, but alive in every sense of the word. As I stood there, witnessing this world that had been torn apart by the choice of the mark, I felt a surge of grief. The suffering was beyond what words could describe. And yet, even in the face of all this despair, I saw something else, something that gave me hope. I watched as a family gathered around a small fire in the wilderness, huddling together for warmth and safety. The father was leading them in prayer, his voice trembling as he called out to God, asking for help, for provision. As he spoke, something incredible happened. The ground beneath their feet began to shift. Slowly, plants began to sprout, small shoots of green pushing up through the dry earth, vines heavy with fruit. It was as if God Himself was answering their prayers. The earth had responded to their faith. It wasn't just a miracle, it was a sign. They weren't alone. God had not abandoned them, even in the wilderness. This was the moment that solidified everything for me. I understood that no matter how bad things got, no matter how hopeless it seemed, faith would always make a way. God's provision was not limited to wealth, comfort, or power. It was something deeper, something eternal, and even if we had to suffer, we would never truly be alone. As I watched these people who had refused to take the mark, I couldn't help but feel both awe and sorrow for them. Their lives were incredibly difficult, no doubt about that. They were cast out from society, isolated in the wilderness or abandoned buildings, struggling to survive. The things we take for granted, food, shelter, safety, were no longer available to them. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, there was something unmistakable about them. Their eyes, despite the hunger, despite the exhaustion, were filled with a fire that I didn't see in the eyes of the marked ones. They were living, not just existing. I watched a man, once a respected doctor, now reduced to digging through the trash for scraps of food. His face was worn, his hands torn from the labor, but there was a light in his eyes, a resolve that told me he had not given up. Nearby, a young woman sat on the steps of an abandoned church, clutching a worn Bible to her chest. The light from a single candle flickered as she read, and though her body trembled from the cold, there was an undeniable strength in the way she held that Bible, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. I could see that she hadn't abandoned her faith. She hadn't given in to despair. And in a way, I realized that these people, these outcasts, were holding on to something far more valuable than anything this world could offer. They were living in truth, in faith, and in defiance of a system that had turned its back on them. The marked had everything, yet they had lost the one thing that mattered, their humanity. These unmarked people, though they had nothing, were richer in spirit than anything I had ever known. The most profound moment, though, came when I watched a family in the wilderness. They were huddled around a small fire, the father leading them in prayer. His voice cracked with emotion as he begged for provision, for help in a world that had stripped them of everything. And as he spoke those words, something miraculous happened. The dry earth beneath them began to tremble, and slowly, plants began to sprout. At first, It was just a few tiny shoots, but then it spread like wildfire. Vines began to grow, thick with fruit. The land had responded to their faith. It was as if the earth itself had heard their prayers and had no choice but to answer. I watched in awe as the family gathered around the food, their faces illuminated by the light of the fire, their hearts full of gratitude. This wasn't just a miracle. It was a testament to something much deeper. It was proof that even when all seemed lost, when everything material had been stripped away, faith could still provide. God's provision wasn't bound by circumstances or resources. It transcended everything. And in that moment, I realized something that has stayed with me since. No matter how bleak things may seem, no matter how desperate the situation, faith in something greater than ourselves can make a way. God doesn't promise that we'll never face hardship, but He does promise to be with us through it all. And the people I saw in that wilderness, those who stood firm in their beliefs, showed me something powerful, that no matter how much you lose, if you hold on to your faith, you'll never truly be without. As I stood there, witnessing the stark contrast between the marked and the unmarked, the weight of it all began to settle in. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. It was about something far more profound. I realized that the people who had taken the mark had done so out of fear. Fear of suffering, fear of rejection, fear of losing everything. But in their decision to choose comfort over conviction, they had forfeited their souls. They had traded their freedom for an illusion of safety, but in doing so, they had locked themselves in a cage of emptiness. The life they were living was like a shadow of what it could have been. The mark had made them safe in the world's eyes, but in the process, it had stripped away the essence of who they were. There was no love, no joy, no purpose in their lives anymore. It was all gone, and I could see it in their eyes. There was no spark, no fire. They had become hollow, mere shells of human beings, walking through life with no sense of direction or meaning. And it hit me in that moment. This was the choice we all would have to face. It wasn't just about survival in the physical sense. It was about surviving spiritually. Would we compromise our beliefs to fit in, to survive in this world? Or would we hold on to what truly matters, no matter the cost? I saw the consequences of both choices, and I couldn't turn away from them. The scene shifted again, and I found myself back in front of Jesus. His gaze was filled with sorrow, yet there was a quiet hope in it as well. He looked at me with such deep compassion, as though he understood the weight of what I had just witnessed. "The time is coming," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with a sense of urgency, "when everyone will have to choose, and when that time comes, there will be no middle ground, no neutral position. You will either stand firm or you will fall. There is no in-between." His words hit me hard. I felt the full weight of their meaning. The world, as we know it, was changing, and we were being called to make a choice, one that would affect not just our survival, but our very souls. I wanted to ask him what we were supposed to do, how we could possibly survive in a world like this, but I couldn't speak. I felt like the answers were already in me, waiting to be revealed. He smiled gently, though, as if reassuring me that there was hope, even in the darkest of times. "Tell them," he said again, "warn them that the time is short, but I will provide. I will always provide for those who stand firm in their faith." And as he spoke those words, a wave of peace washed over me, and I understood. No matter how dark the days ahead would be, no matter how difficult the choices, there would always be a way forward for those who trusted in him. Then, as if the experience had already been intense enough, I felt myself being pulled backward, away from Jesus and the visions I had witnessed. It wasn't like a gradual fading. It was more like being yanked through layers of light and darkness, moving too fast to comprehend. I wanted to hold on to what I had just learned, to stay in that place where everything made sense, but I couldn't. I was falling, tumbling through an endless abyss, filled with bright flashes and shadows that came and went in an instant. The whole experience felt like it lasted forever, yet at the same time, it was over in the blink of an eye. My body was aching, my senses overwhelmed, and I felt like I was losing grip on everything I had seen. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, a sharp pain hit me. I gasped, feeling the rush of air in my lungs, and then the overwhelming sensation of being alive again. My eyes snapped open, and the world around me came back into focus. I was back in my room, lying on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. Elena was beside me, her face pale with fear as she held my hand, calling my name. I couldn't speak at first. I could barely move. It felt like I had just returned from another world, and everything was still too surreal for me to fully grasp. But I knew, deep in my heart, that everything I had just experienced was real. It had been a glimpse into something far beyond what we understand as life and death. It was a message, a warning, a call to action that I couldn't ignore. As I struggled to sit up, Elena's voice cut through the fog in my mind. "Veronica, please stay with me. Don't leave me." Her voice trembled with desperation, but all I could think about was what I had seen, what I had learned. I knew my life would never be the same again. The world I had known, the comfort of my simple life, was gone. I had been given a purpose, to warn others, to share what I had experienced, to make sure people understood the gravity of what was coming. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew that we all needed to wake up. The time was short, the choice would soon be upon us, and we needed to be ready. I couldn't ignore the vision of the people who had taken the mark, the emptiness in their eyes, the hollowness in their souls. I couldn't ignore the families in the wilderness, the ones who had refused to compromise, who had held onto their faith even when it seemed like everything was against them. And most of all, I couldn't ignore the love and the hope I had felt in Jesus' presence. He had shown me that no matter how dark things get, faith could always make a way. But we had to choose. We had to decide whether we would stand firm or fall. As I sat there, struggling to come to terms with everything I had just experienced, a deep and almost overwhelming sense of urgency filled me, one that I couldn't ignore. The vision I had been shown wasn't just an experience, it was a direct message, a warning, a call to action that left my soul shaken to its core. I knew that my life had been spared for a reason, but I didn't fully understand what that reason was until now. I had witnessed the path humanity was heading down, and it was a path that terrified me. The mark, this simple, subtle symbol, wasn't just a physical thing. It was a spiritual submission, a choice that would not only define our lives, but our eternal destiny. The world, as it is now, will tell us that we have no choice but to accept this mark to survive, to thrive, to belong in the system that's been created. It will make us believe that it's the only way, the only path to a better life, that we have to conform, that resisting will leave us hopeless. But what I saw in the vision was something far more dangerous. Survival, as they define it, is not enough. It doesn't matter how much comfort or security we gain in the world. If we give up our souls in the process, if we let go of everything that makes us who we are, then what's left? Absolutely nothing. The people who had taken the mark were nothing but hollow shells, walking through life in a state of numbness and robotic routine, completely unaware that they had given up the one thing that made them truly human, their ability to feel, to love, to question, to live with purpose. They had surrendered it all for a false sense of safety and ease, and in doing so, they had lost their very essence. But the ones who stood firm, who resisted, even in the face of unimaginable hardship, were the ones who had something real to live for. They weren't perfect, and their lives were far from easy, but they had faith. They had something no system could take away from them. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I had to hold on to that. I had to hold on to what mattered most: my faith, my purpose, my soul. I couldn't ignore the truth I had been shown. I had to share it. I had to warn others because the time was coming. Soon. I don't know when, but I know it's close. Now, as I reflect on everything that happened, I realize just how profoundly it has changed me, how it has reshaped the very way I view the world and my place in it. I can't go back to the life I had before, the life I thought was simple and secure. I can't unsee what I've seen, and I can't pretend that everything is fine, that everything will just go back to normal. The truth has been revealed to me in a way that I can never deny. The choice that I witnessed, the one that will soon come for all of us, is one that will shape the entire course of the future. This isn't just a decision about how we'll survive in a material world. It's a choice that will define who we are on a soul-deep level. Will we choose to stand firm in our faith, to trust in something greater than ourselves, even when it seems like everything around us is falling apart? Or will we choose the easy path, the one that promises comfort and security, but at the cost of our very souls? I don't know what the future holds. None of us do. But I know that I've been given a message that I can't keep to myself. I've seen what's coming, and it's not a matter of if, but when. The choice we will all face is coming, and there will be no middle ground. There will be no neutrality. We will either choose to hold on to what matters most, to choose faith, or we will give in to the world's demands, letting go of our integrity, our beliefs, and ultimately, our very souls. It's a decision that will affect us not just in this life, but for eternity. The time to decide is now. The world will tell us that we have no choice, that we must compromise to survive, but we have to choose wisely. And I pray, with all my heart, that we all make the right choice. Because once that choice is made, it's final. I pray that we stand firm, that we resist the pull of the world's temptations, and that we never let go of what truly matters. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how dark the world becomes, we have to keep our faith. That's the only thing that will ever truly save us.